Welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. I am your host, Lindsay, aka OMG Tarot. This week, we're resuming our deep dives into the major arcana by taking a look at number 18, the moon. Why the moon? Because it was a listener request. And I'd like to remind you right now that you're always welcome to request topics for me. Seriously. You know my Instagram handle by now, and if not, I'm going to repeat it again at the end of this episode, but my DMs are always open. So is my email inbox. I want you to hear topics that you care about and that you're interested in, and that goes beyond the major arcana, because we're eventually going to run out of major arcana cards. There's only 22 of them. So if there's something that's been on your mind as a reader, or a topic that you just really want to know more about, whether it's how to approach a certain tarot topic, or different decks, or certain processes for reading the cards, or putting them together, or crafting a narrative out of a series of cards you pull, feel free to let me know. I want you to enjoy this show, and that means making it feel like an ongoing conversation between us. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode as much as I enjoyed it. Honestly, one of my favorite things about doing tarot is the community that surrounds it. There's some really awesome people here, and if you're looking for community, here are a few of my tips for finding one locally in person. Online is a whole different ball of wax, but first, let's talk about in person. Meetup.com is a great place to meet other tarot card readers and really people who gather in your area to do anything hobby related. I've had a lot of luck with Meetup.com, and I found my first in-person tarot study group there. And honestly, I wouldn't be where I am today without it, because that group kept me going and kept me accountable to continuing my practice and learning and building. And it was fun to go to, so shout out Northern New Jersey Tarot, because you guys were instrumental in my development as a reader. If there's no local tarot groups on Meetup.com, where can you find one? I highly recommend going to any kind of metaphysical shop, so anywhere that you can buy, well, tarot cards, obviously, but also things like crystals, incense, books, anything witchy, because a lot of times those are the places that you're going to find community groups and also workshops. So you might find a tarot study group there, or perhaps a workshop like an in-person tarot class, or an in-person crystal workshop, really anything, and that's how you're going to make the connections with the people who have the same interests that you have. So if that's an option that's available to you, give it a try. That's another great way. In fact, Northern New Jersey Tarot, that's where we would meet up, was in a metaphysical shop within my area. Where else can you find in-person groups? Check out your local community ed, which might be run through your library or your local recreation department. They might offer a tarot class or something adjacent because, hint hint, that's where I teach tarot classes. So, see if you can find one there, even if you feel like you're a pretty advanced reader and you don't necessarily need beginner level instructions. It might not be bad to just connect with who's going to those classes, maybe take a refresher course or connect with the instructor and see if they have any lead-ins to any sort of local community. You could also go to local festivals and things that, if those exist near you, any kind of metaphysical market or art fair or curated craft show with kind of an alternative, witchy, however you might want to label it, bent. Those are a thing that exist in my neck of the woods too. That's where people who do this stuff go and hang out and do things. So get out there and connect with your local tarot community. Having people to hang out with definitely enhances the experience, at least in my opinion, because it's a captive audience of people you can do readings for, it's a captive audience of people you can get readings from, and it's people who you can bounce ideas off and troubleshoot and just talk shop about tarot. And if they're fellow readers, they're probably pretty cool, so of course those are good people to have as your friends. But what if an in-person tarot community doesn't exist in your city or your neighborhood or even somewhere that's reasonably close-ish enough for you to go to? Start your own. And I know that's not feasible for everybody, but if you can, why not start your own? That's how communities develop. It might start small. It might be just you and one or two other people hanging out in a Panera once a month, drinking coffee, slinging cards. But eventually there will be a fourth and a fifth, and you'll go from just slinging cards to maybe working your way through a tarot book like Mary K. Greer's Tarot for Yourself or one of Sasha Graham's books. People will appreciate that you made the first move. And even if you're kind of shy and maybe feel a little socially awkward or like, oh, I'm not ready to start a group, I'm not good enough yet, trust me, I think if you can organize a group, you're good enough. You don't have to be an expert, amazing, professional tarot card reader to be a central hub that connects other readers together and encourages them to talk to each other and build some community. So I know that went on a bit long, and I do want to address online groups too, because sometimes meeting in person just isn't feasible. Maybe you already tried the in-person avenue and it's just not working with your schedule or it's not working in your town, so you gotta go online. In my opinion, it's a good enough substitute when in-person isn't available, but I just really prefer in-person. But anyway, alright, so where do you meet fellow tarot card readers online? Social media is always an option. Train your algorithm on what you like. So on, say, Instagram and TikTok, engage with tarot posts, engage with astrology, engage with whatever you're interested in. Which, if you're listening to my show, you're probably already doing. I don't need to explain to you how algorithms work. On platforms like Facebook, it's a lot easier to find a specific group. There's also a very active tarot subreddit called, predictably, Tarot. So just reddit.com/r/tarot, and there's readers there, and your voice will contribute to the conversation. There's gotta also be, and now this is where I'm getting a bit out of my element with things that I haven't personally experienced, but they might be very worthwhile avenues for you. Discord servers. I guarantee you that you can find a tarot-focused Discord server somewhere, and that you'll be able to talk shop there and share polls and interact and engage. So those are just a couple of options for you if you're interested in joining some kind of tarot community and finding a place where you can share your polls with people and ask questions and get feedback. Because I do think that's very important for readers. I know there are plenty of readers who only read for themselves and treat this as a very solitary hobby. And if that's working for you, that's great, that's wonderful. But a lot of people that I've known and worked with have really grown immensely through turning tarot into something that they do collaboratively. Now let's talk about the moon. The moon is number 18 in the major arcana. Looking at it, we see a patch of land in the center of the card that has a dog on the left-hand side and a wolf on the right-hand side, and they're separated by what appears to be a gravel path. That gravel path is leading over some hills out to what looks like maybe it's the ocean, maybe it's a mountain range. Nonetheless, I'm going with ocean because it's blue. It's water. It's the same exact color as what's clearly water all the way in the foreground, that little pond where there's a lobster crawling out. Where is that lobster going? Who is that lobster? What's that lobster's relationship to the dog, the wolf, and the moon that also has sun rays around it that really is making a big focal point up here on the upper portion of the card? Another element that we've got to call out here is that design of two pillars and a pathway between them. You've seen it before. You've seen it on Death. You've seen it on the High Priestess. This is a very popular motif in your Rider-Waite-Smith deck and also in other decks that are based on the Rider-Waite-Smith. So maybe that's the first thing we'll examine here. On a tarot card, that two pillars with the path between motif, and sometimes the path isn't presented as quite so literal, like take a look over at the High Priestess. There's not a path there, but she's clearly sitting between them. She is the path. This two pillars motif typically symbolizes a gateway and something that once you cross through there, there's really no going back. It's a threshold. On this card, what's the threshold you're passing through? Well, it's the threshold of coming into contact with your shadow side and taking a look at all the things that are often obscured in darkness, but nonetheless there. So let's back things up a bit. In tarot, the moon typically symbolizes the dark side of things, and not dark as in scary or evil, but dark as in not illuminated, essentially running in the background while you're primarily focused on what's in the foreground and what's under the spotlight. If you're familiar with the term shadow side or shadow self, this is largely what it's referring to. The shadow self it's a whole rabbit hole of a topic that I'm not going to cover in this episode because it's an episode or multiple unto itself. Your shadow self is the parts of you that you don't always want to acknowledge, and the parts of you that are, just like the dark side of the moon, operating beneath the surface and in the background, and nonetheless having an influence on the things that you do consciously and in the foreground, but you might not quite realize it. Kind of like a computer program that while you're playing The Sims, you've got all these other programs running in the background, making your computer able to operate. So if we want to read this card literally, it's about that threshold of coming into contact with your shadow side and really looking at those things, shining a light on the parts of yourself that typically operate in the darkness, and the fallout of that. You really can't go back from doing that type of work, and that's what the other side of this gateway symbolizes. If we take a look, that path keeps on going and keeps on going, and it appears to either climb up a mountain or be bobbing there in really tall waves. Whether that's mountains or waves is up to your interpretation. I tend to interpret that as waves all the way in the background for a few reasons. One, perhaps it's simple, but they're the exact same color as the water that's in the foreground of the card. I think that if these were meant to not be water, they would be a different color. But reading into it a little more symbolically, this card is associated with the zodiac sign Pisces, which is a water sign. So I think it's not a stretch at all to say that this is water, and more specifically, this is the ocean with its rolling waves and its significant depths. Pisces is the last of the water signs. It's the one that goes the deepest. A few characteristics of Pisces are they're the dreamers of the zodiac. They're the mystics. They're the ones who feel the really deep feelings, and they're the ones who kind of straddle that line between our real tangible world and the mystical dream world and the abstract world. They're the ones who really easily cross that threshold. And Pisces is the very last sign of the zodiac. It's the end point of that cycle, right before things cross back over into Aries, which is head start, me, the ego. And to attach that interpretation of this being rolling waves with what this card largely symbolizes, it's an emotional process to do shadow work and to come to terms with the parts of yourself that you might not always acknowledge and you might not always like. But it's important work, and it's work that will also make you a more emotionally aware person and really enable you to swim to depths that you might not have swam to previously. Because let's compare this ocean all the way in the background with the pond that's there in the foreground. Ponds aren't very deep. That can make them comfortable. Ponds are also warm and calm. Because they're not so deep, they warm up quickly when they're exposed to the sunlight. And take a look, there's little ripples here, little itty-bitty ripples from that lobster's movement, but those ripples are teeny. They're nothing compared to the rolling waves of the ocean. And what's the lobster doing? To me, it looks like the lobster is coming out of that pond and setting itself on a path toward that ocean. You could interpret this as the lobster is choosing to exit that comfortable, safe, warm pond where it knows every nook and cranny and can trust that nothing is ever going to be too challenging, and opting to move toward the ocean, knowingly putting itself into a place where there are predators and there are difficulties, but there's also so much more potential and so much more room for growth and exploration. And in order to get to the ocean, it needs to cross through that threshold and it needs to come to terms with everything that operates under the surface. Which, for a lobster, what kind of shadow work do we think a lobster would do? I don't know. For a human, a lot of times it's challenging your subconscious biases and taking a critical look at your belief systems and challenging them and really determining, is what I was taught really true? And is what I believe actually serving me and actually helping me, both my beliefs about myself as well as my beliefs about the world around me? Now, I know lobsters are actually smarter animals than we give them credit for, so maybe lobsters have those kind of thoughts. Maybe they don't. They are crustaceans, they are kind of simple, but look into lobsters. They actually live pretty fascinating lives when we don't catch them and eat them. So if the illustration on this card is the story of this lobster choosing to go outside its comfort zone and walk a dangerous path on the way to deeper, more tumultuous, but ideally, hopefully, more fulfilling waters, what about the dog and the wolf? Think about the relationship between a dog and a wolf. They're very similar creatures, and previously it was thought that wolves were domesticated to become what we know as the modern dog today. Now there's some controversy around that, suggesting that perhaps it was a common ancestor that both evolved into the modern gray wolf as well as our domestic dog. But regardless, they're essentially the same species. Canis lupus is the wild wolf, and Canis lupus familiaris is the domestic dog. So why is this relevant? Well, because despite being the same species, they're very different. One of them is a wild animal that relies on its wits and its instincts and intelligence and complex social life to operate and to live in the wild. The other evolved to live with us and evolved to rely on humans and look to humans for guidance and for food and to pick up after them. So they live in two very different realities, and one can't survive in the other's reality. But paradoxically, they are the same species, and whether one evolved from the other or they have a common ancestor, we're dealing with, at the genetic level, essentially the same thing here. You really can't separate the two. And I think on this card, this symbolizes both your day-to-day operating in the spotlight self as well as your shadow side. It's your primal self that's always running in the background and always having some sort of influence over what you do, as well as the you that you present to the world. It's the face that you put on when you go to work and the mask you wear when you have to go to social functions and when you have to function in the domesticated world. As the lobster travels that path over the land, which, by the way, is not the safest, most familiar place for a lobster to be. The lobster wants to go from water into more water. Lobsters are not land animals, but this lobster's got to be grounded in order to do this type of work and make it all the way to the ocean. That lobster walks past the wolf and the dog and can't help but observe them. And now let's take a look at them in relation to each other. If we take a look over here, the dog is looking up at the moon. The wolf is looking at the dog. Perhaps you can interpret this as your base primal self examining how you've adapted to fit in a society, while that more domesticated part of you is seeking to connect with your shadow side. They're both looking at each other and understanding each other. And all the while, the lobster's got to move through this in order to reach the ocean. So, it's a deeply introspective card, and it's a card that really speaks to the process of turning that mirror on yourself and examining who are you both at the surface and at the deeper levels. And are you staying in your comfort zone like that pond, or are you doing uncomfortable self-reflection In order to put yourself into a more nourishing, bigger, broader environment, just know that if you're going to do that, there's no going back. And also that the journey will not necessarily be easy. In fact, it's probably going to be pretty challenging, and it's also likely going to be very long because let's take a look at just how long this path is. It goes on, and I think that's a reference to how this sort of work is really never done. You might make breakthroughs, you might make progress, but we don't see an ending for this path. We just see it coming up over the highest wave, presumably going back down the back of it. We've seen a path to symbolize a long journey elsewhere in the major arcana. We saw it over on Temperance, where it spoke to a similar journey of continually learning how to keep things in balance and manage all of the elements at play in your world. You can't rush the moon and the energy it brings, and you can't rush temperance and the energy that brings. I think the moon comes with this sense of some stumbling through the darkness and walking toward the light. So to give it some context, let's drop it into the major arcana. At number 18, it comes after the star, number 17, and it comes right before the sun, number 19. If we think back to the star, remember the star is rebuilding with a refreshed, renewed sense of what's right and what do I need. The star comes after the tower, so it's that sense of rebuilding, and this time around, rebuilding from a place that's a lot more in tune with who you are and what you need. It's a lot more being yourself after everything crumbled down. So once we master what's going on in the star, this sense of if I need to go outside the norm and if I need to think outside the box, I'm going to do what's right for me. And in doing that, I'm putting emotional support out there and I'm sharing myself with the greater community. Then we move into the moon, which is self-reflection. So now that you've rebuilt, found a place that feels like you're really acting in your own best interest, now the moon is saying, okay, look inward, check in on that. How's that working out for you? You've cultivated this public face. How is it aligned with what's running you from the inside? And through doing that sort of work, where you hold that mirror up to yourself, you're able to see your true, genuine self much more clearly and allow it to really come out and express without any sort of inhibition. That's the sun. At number 19, take a look. You've got that naked baby on the horse, which is also naked because it's the only horse in the deck that's not wearing a bridle or a saddle. It's just pure, uninhibited freedom, the kind of freedom that can only come from genuinely knowing yourself inside and out. As a major arcana card, I read this card as an overarching theme in the querent's life, and you may pull it alongside a minor arcana card, and that might add up to the person literally doing what's depicted on the minor card against the backdrop of this moon phase. They might be working through a period of this intense self-reflection and this going outside their comfort zone in order to grow and progress as a person, and they might pull that against, well, let's do a sample reading or two. Let's see. Let's just do a very simple example reading of combining a minor card with the moon. And out of my deck, I just pulled the Ace of Cups. So, an ace is something brand new on your plate, and cups are all about emotions. So, we have two very watery, emotionally driven cards here, and I would read this combination of you have new feelings cropping up. You're at a point in your life where you're actively doing the work that we see depicted on the moon, and it's bringing up new feelings. Not old feelings that you've suppressed resurfacing, but literally brand new ones. It feels refreshing in a lot of ways. I read this as very a very reassuring combination of cards because, well, who wouldn't want new emotions to come out through the process of examining yourself and working on yourself in order to understand yourself better? Let's do another poll, this time with a clear question in mind. My cat has been hanging out on my lap for the bulk of recording this episode, so I'll ask, how can I best relate to my cat? Let's see, let's pull another card out. And I'm not specifically pulling for a minor this time. I'm playing with a full deck. I've pulled the Knight of Wands. Alright, so let's create some context. As you remember from a few episodes ago, the Knights are kind of like young adults. Everything is fresh to them and everything is new, and they're learning a lot of life's lessons for the first time. And the Wands are fire energy, so I would read this as taking on the role of that Knight of Wands and really leaning into that role of somebody who's experiencing a lot of firsts and a lot of things that are very action oriented. So perhaps for the first time, I am having to really kind of get into a cat's mind and play like a cat and think like a cat. And I think that folds in with our moon because the moon is a lot of that looking into yourself and self-reflection and that idea of your primal self. Do I need to get down on all fours and crouch on the ground and put myself in her position? Yes, I think I do. Perhaps this is saying, well, if you want to understand her, you need to move through your home and move through your world the way she does. And that's going to mean new experiences. All right, I guess that's what I'm going to do. And maybe I'll learn a bit more about myself in the process. I think I will, because that's what the moon is all about. That about concludes our discussion of the moon today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something valuable. If you'd like to give me a follow on Instagram, my handle is its_omg_tarot. You can also check out my website, omgtarot.com. And if you have ideas for future episodes or anything that you are really interested in hearing about, let me know. That offer is still on the table, and I would love to hear your thoughts. So, alrighty, I think that about sums it up for us today. Have a great night, and I'll talk to you again next Thursday. Bye-bye.